Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can find and subscribe to this podcast via Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our site, vmspod.com, to find more information, as well as our RSS feed, which you can plug into any podcatcher so you never miss an episode of the Virtual Memories Show. You can also follow me on Blue Sky, Instagram, and YouTube, where I go by vmspod, and subscribe to my semi-weekly newsletter at buttondown.com/vmspod. Well, I am getting this episode up a little late because I had to attend a day-long conference in Washington on Tuesday, and traveling by train during the present heat dome left me pretty walloped on Monday, so I wasn't going to edit the show in the hotel room that night. The conference went fine. Actually, the conference itself was okay, but I had some really great conversations on the side, which is my real reason for attending this sort of stuff, because schmoozing, as I've said, is my mutant superpower, whether it's for the podcast or in my professional life. And I picked up on some hot goss, which might impair my ability to make the podcast or do much of anything starting this October, but I'll work that stuff out professionally. We'll see. But I am not too stressed about taking an extra day to bring you this show, because this week's guest's book was like 30 years in the making. So, all things considered, one day's delay isn't that bad. So my guest this time is Paul Karasik, who was on the show back in 2018, along with Mark Newgarden, for their book, How to Read Nancy. This time, Paul is back to talk about a project that first saw the light of day in the mid-90s. It is Paul Auster's The New York Trilogy. It's from Pantheon, and this is a graphic adaptation, as in comics, of City of Glass, Ghosts, and The Locked Room, a trio of novels by Auster in the 1980s that postmodernly revolve around crime fiction, but go way beyond that into a lot of topics that we're going to talk about today. So the first book, City of Glass, that was drawn by David Mazzucchelli. And the second was by Lorenzo Mattotti, who's been on the show also. And the third, The Locked Room, was illustrated by Paul, or drawn by Paul, or turned into comics by Paul. Once we get started, you are going to hear all about the history of this adaptation, how each artist got involved, and when I first encountered it, which was in the mid-90s, so I'm not going to go over all that here. What I will say is that each book is rendered in a different mode, not just a different style based on each artist, but in a different mode of storytelling, in a sense, and they fit together into this kind of incredible whole. And until we talked, I really didn't know what role Paul played in the process of adaptation. Wasn't sure how much, because in the original version, there was just City of Glass, which said by Paul Karasik and David Mazzucchelli, and I didn't know how much of a contribution Paul had made to Mazzucchelli's art and story. That all comes out in this conversation in a good way. The New York Trilogy, this adaptation captures the strangeness and uncanniness of Auster's novels. Like I say, it sort of postmodernly revolves around crime fiction and uses that to kind of get at the mysteries that unfold out of our lives as language having beings. And the sense in which New York kind of reflects the unknowability of the world, how, like, even the things that we construct, whether it's a building or a family or a sentence, is out of our control and is out of our knowing. That is, these are mystery stories with no solution, where meaning itself is the murder victim, which I know sounds frustrating, but all three books engage deeply with what it means to be a knowing person, or to be a person who wants to know. And I'm talking about both the original novels and this adaptation. And as we talk, Paul is going to downplay his own art in the third book of the trilogy. We go into that. But he is measuring up against a couple of legends in Mazzucchelli and Matoti, and that is just an impossible match. What really comes through in his take on the Locked Room, that third book, is the formal aspect of comics, the ways in which he uses the tools of comics to specifically to translate Auster onto the page. And we talk about his relationship with Auster and a lot of other stuff in the course of this conversation, you'll see. But when I said translate just now, I mean translate. This volume, all three books of it, they constitute an act of translation. And that's what I see in the process of adaptation here, that sense of deep reading that I have talked about in recent months with Damien Searles, and particularly Cecile Wajsbrot a couple of weeks back, where we talked about writing a novel about translating Virginia Woolf into French, and then seeing what it was like having that translated back into English. Anyway, this is comics as translation, comics as adaptation, comics as story. I enjoyed the heck out of this adaptation, so go get Paul Auster's The New York Trilogy. It's out from Pantheon now, adapted by Paul Karasik, David Mazzucchelli, and Lorenzo Matoti. Now, as caveats go, we recorded at Yaddo Artists Retreat up in Saratoga Springs, New York. I'd last been there 30 years ago, a year or two before I first read City of Glass. It's this old mansion and extensive grounds, and Paul's going to talk about the whole experience of being an artist up there. But the caveat part is we recorded in this big old music room, so there's a bit of an echo. Also, there's a couple of flutters of static during the session. I think that may have been due to the electrical system in the mansion, because I plugged into the wall. Anyway, you'll see. Here's Paul's bio from the book. Two-time Eisner Award winner Paul Karasik began his career as the associate editor of Art Spiegelman and Francois Mouly's Raw magazine. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Yorker. There's a more extensive biography at his website, but you'll find that later. And now, the 2025 Virtual Memories conversation with Paul Karasik. So tell me about the history of the New York trilogy, because I bought City of Glass in that neon lit edition back in 1995 at a B. Dalton in Annapolis, Maryland. And
where did you find it there? Because there was no graphic novel shelf back then.
I mentioned humor back then.
Yeah.
It was not in the mysteries section or the postmodern strange directions for
next
mysteries.
to a Wizard of Id paperback. Exactly.
But yeah, I remember seeing that, and I was a huge Mazzucchelli guy at the time. So I picked it up then, and it's the first book in a trilogy. Surely the next two will be out any time now. And
you had to wait a few years.
So it's been 30 years. Tell me about the history of the project and how it came together, and how it feels to have it complete now.
Quite separate questions.
Yes.
So it all goes back to, the first line of City of Glass is a phone call that started it. And I think that's a good place to start the book, and it's a good place to start the story, because in essence, I feel like I am a character in a Paul Auster novel, a life rife with circumstance and unpredictable coincidence. I met Auster just after the trilogy had been published. 1986 or something, 85, 86, because his son, Daniel, was in my 5th grade art class that I was teaching at Packer Collegiate in Brooklyn Heights, where I was living. And Daniel was a funny, charming 10-year-old, and Auster was coming in for a parent-teacher conference, and I had heard that he was an author. So I was intrigued. I went to the bookstore. I bought the trilogy. I read the trilogy thinking that, well, when he comes in, I can kiss his ass a little bit and say, oh, I read your books, that sort of thing. And City of Glass in particular, I remember I always, like right now, I carry a sketchbook with me. And I had made some notes, just some visual notes in there, thinking about the possibility of City of Glass being a comic. Just a couple of pages of very loose sketch ideas. Anyhow, Auster came in for a parent-teacher conference, and there was no need to kiss his ass. In fact, we never talked about the trilogy at all because there was so much to talk about this kid. So I don't see him again, don't think of the books. They're sitting on my bookshelf. In 1989, my wife and I moved to Martha's Vineyard, where we live now, and about 91, 92, something like that, Art Spiegelman calls. And not uncommon at the time, several times a year after I left New York City, we'll talk to each other on the phone, and he says, I'm calling specifically because I'm helping editor in New York adapt contemporary noir novels into graphic novels. But we chose in one that appears to be impossible to do out of the gate because just we wanted the challenge. And we had several artists come in and try it, and I just think it might be in your wheelhouse when you want to take a crack at that. I was like, well, what's this book? He said, City of Glass by Paul Auster. And I said, I've already started. So I went down to the basement, dusted off the sketchbook. There was some useful things, but I think more importantly, it had just been sort of stewing in my head somewhere in my subconscious because the creation of it, Art already had signed on David Mazzucchelli, which was extraordinarily lucky. The whole thing is extraordinarily lucky. I did a comprehensive, full drawn page-by-page breakdown of the entire book and gave it to David. And David took my sketch and did his version of it. And in doing so, really brought it. I think the most important contribution of David's was to bring some air into the book. Mm-hmm. And so we went back and forth a few times, and then we ran it by one fateful afternoon, a rainy afternoon. I remember standing outside, taking a deep breath because we were going up to the Spiegelman's apartment with Auster, and we reviewed the whole thing page by page. And then it came out. But from getting that phone call that started it to actually getting David flew through. It just was like it was meant to happen. Yeah. There were no missteps along the way. Everything really clicked.
You mentioned bringing air to it. How close was his adaptation? How close was his version to your version? Because I went into it with no idea whatsoever. I didn't know you because I'm 22. I'm not indie comics.
Well,
exactly.
I didn't know me either.
Yes. And my Mazzucchelli had already evolved into Rubber Blanket,
sure.
So I had he's an artist.
And Daredevil, Batman Year One.
Those are my high school years.
Yeah.
And when I met him years later at Cab, not only did I mention a story from Rubber Blanket, I didn't mention Big Man. I mentioned Discovering America, and his eyes lit up with, ooh, you like that one?
Yeah,
I'm like, yeah.
So that's a really
I'm not
great
citing
story.
Batman for you. I'm going deep with your stuff that means a lot to me. But for him, how close was his version to what you had laid out?
Very close.
Yeah.
I mean, so for instance, chapter 2, which was of the original novel, which is the monologue by the this young troubled man who has been locked in a closet by his father for a long time. In the novel, in Auster's original novel, it's like 20-something pages. And turning that into 12 pages of comics, had a certain number of challenges, and I sort of figured out the code to that, figured that out. And so the breakdown that I did for that, David pretty much followed panel by panel.
Gotcha.
But then...
because I stole some of that for a strip I'm doing for Dean Haspiel this summer. So
you're welcome.
just it just had to work for me as icons.
Well, believe me, I stole it too. So
there's nothing original. But
in fact, that tale of that word balloon is Karl Barks' thing. And of course, the 9-panel background is 100% Kurtzman. The book would not exist without Harvey Kurtzman.
Most comics wouldn't.
Most modern comics wouldn't. But then the other thing that David brought to it was he's got a unique sense of timing, and so he entered some silent panels, I believe, that I wouldn't have put in there. But most importantly, I was really slavish in my first draft to that 9-panel grid that breaks down over the course of the story and creates sort of this visual subtext for the whole thing. And you know how it starts out very rigid, and the 9-panel grid is sort of symbolic of the protagonist, Quinn's mental state, where he leads a very regulated life, and by the end of the book, the panels start to wiggle and jiggle until right at the end of the book, they all fall apart. So the structure and the form of the book actually support the psychological state of the protagonist. But I was really nailed down to that 9-panel grid. And David came in and was like, okay, let's make this 3 panels together. You know, having drawn Daredevil and Batman for such a long time, David could really draw the hell out of New York City. Yeah. So where I might like hedge that and just kind of make a little squiggle for a skyscraper, David, is drawing like stoops and brownstones and like curved windows, and it's just magnificent. His drawing is it's magnificent. Yeah.
So what was Auster's reaction in terms of seeing it in comics?
Yeah, so that, as I said, fateful afternoon, very memorable. We're going upstairs trudging up that endless staircase to the Spiegelman's loft, and sitting down, there's Art and Auster. I don't think I'd seen him for years, maybe at that point. It's very nice to see him. And we sit down at a small table like this, and everyone's drinking coffee, and just go, okay, here it is, page 1. And immediately, Spiegelman's like, well, maybe you could have the character enter left or right or something like that. And page 2, he's like, well, let's move that word balloon here. Maybe you could cut that, put half the balloon at top, half in the bottom. And like everything Spiegelman says, it's a great idea because, he's master of the formal aspects of comics. And, maybe a page will go by and he's like, oh, this is good. Meanwhile, Auster, stone cold silence. And he's sitting there taking a little sip of black coffee and smoking that black cigar and just kind of nodding his head. And, we're like on page 4 or 5 and like nothing. And I'm starting to sweat, because he hasn't seen anything at this point. Yeah. Okay, and now we're like on page 8. Spiegelman's like, maybe start out with, we need more of an establishing shot here, pull out a little bit here. Okay, good. Auster, coffee, puffing, right? Finally, like at page 12, Auster says, wait. And I'm thinking, okay, this is it. We're dead, we're dead. And Auster points to the page, taps on it. He says right here, this is supposed to be a colon, not a semicolon. Oh, okay, good. Okay, good. Just a couple of pages later, he says, I think you got the tense wrong here. This should be in the present tense. And I would have said would, not rather than could. And, all through it. And that his comments, he was laser focused. Yeah. Because the given in this assignment was, you can do whatever, he said, you can do whatever you want to do in interpreting this book, but every word that appears has to be a word that I wrote.
Yeah.
So, of course, there's 90% or 80% fewer words, and we've got the pictures doing most of the heavy lifting. But so he was very attentive to making sure that all the words were his.
Did he get comics? Did he
Honestly,
get the vocabulary that we understand, you and I? It's not a knock. I mean, it's almost genetic for some people. They read the words or they look at the pictures, and it's... I
would have to say no.
Yeah.
And this became clearer in the other 2 books, where I did things in the other 2 books. At least my memory of that is fresher. that he just didn't, it kind of went by him. But that said, he read them. Thankfully, he read them before he died last year. Saw all of the finished art and approved it and liked it. So that,
I figure he's worked in film. He understands collaboration.
Yeah, very good.
And that's a form. It's not my form. This is I wrote the words. This becomes something else.
Yeah,
but I just wondered whether he had a comics brain.
No, I would say no.
Yeah. So tell me about the jump from 1994 to books 2 and 3.
So I guess I always thought in the back of my head, well, maybe one day I'll get to tackling these other 2 books. But I didn't really understand them the way that I understood City of Glass.
They're very different than
They're very different. All 3 of the books are different from each other. And City of Glass is I would say the strongest narrative.
I felt that you lured me in
arc
back in the 90s. I got better read the other 2 now. I got to get the whole trilogy. And I felt like you bait and switch me. I'm just kidding.
Okay. So I would wander around whenever I traveled someplace for a number of years with the other 2 paperbacks, or I'd take one and then I'd take the other. And I must have read them both at least a dozen times over the intervening years, but I never really felt like I understood them. And I remember when sort of the lightning bolt moment happened. I was in France in Angoulême, not for the comics festival, but prior to the comics festival, there's a school there where a graduate school in comics. You can get a comics major. And for a number of years there, I was teaching at the school prior to the festival. And I was walking along the river there, thinking about the books, and I just read Ghosts. I brought it with me. I was reading it, and I just stopped, and I was like, oh, I know what this book is about. And when I figured out what that book was about, it wasn't long before I doped out what The Locked Room was really about. And I didn't really start working on them. I talked to Oster, and I said, I got back, and maybe it was sometime towards the end of the year, and I called him up, and I said, I've been thinking about these other 2 books, and I just want to run this idea by you. This is, if I was to adapt them, this is sort of what my core idea is, that the second book, Ghosts, if City of Glass is about fiction, the nature of fiction, and giving things names, and is this coffee cup that I'm holding really a coffee cup if we take away the name coffee cup? Mm-hmm. And the main character is living a fictive life. He's pretending to be Paul Auster, the detective, but he's really a writer. Is he really a detective? So it's about fiction. The second book is about reading fiction. And the third book is about writing fiction. And he looked at me and he said, I think there's only one other person who's figured that out. And he said, yeah, go ahead. And so I went ahead.
Tell me about getting Matoti on board.
So
you're raising the bar there. Mazzucchelli and Matoti.
So the second book, it's interesting because when the 25th anniversary of City of Glass, we did an event at Comic Arts Brooklyn with myself and David Mazzucchelli and Art Spiegelman and Paul Auster. And Bill Karlopoulos did the interview, did a splendid job, as he often does. And in the front row, there was Francoise and the Matotis. They're good friends. And, afterwards, I lived in Italy for a year. And it was just coincidentally the same year that City of Glass came out in a translation of Coccadino. By far, the most beautiful of all the international editions. They have a printer in Bologna who really knows how to print black. And so I found myself hanging out with these Italian cartoonists. Igor was the ringmaster, and Gippy, Baru, Lustal, and Matoti. And so I go to the year I was there, I got invited to different comics festivals and became a little friendly with Lorenzo. And I knew that the second book was going to be more like an illustrated book, which is how it turned out. And I thought, well, who's the greatest illustrator I know? And it's, Lorenzo. So that's how, I just asked him, and he was like, well, yeah. And actually, the first version that I did, I didn't have him in mind. And so it was much more comicsy.
Yeah, more
panels. Yeah. And then when he came on board, he's like, well, I don't really want to do so many panels and so much comics. And I was like, great.
Yeah.
Because the whole idea of that book is that to lull the reader into thinking that it's a picture book, and then about halfway through, switch it up for a couple of pages, and then go back to a picture book, and then switch it up again, and then switch it up again into maybe many panels or a couple of pages of prose, and it's unpredictable. The idea here, Gil, is that the reader is forced to consider consciously or subconsciously, unconsciously rather, how they interact with the printed page. Because that's the problem, that's the core problem that the protagonist has. It's not the mystery. The mystery is just...
It's always the literal MacGuffin.
It's just the layer.
Mechanism.
It's the mechanism. It's layer A. But what this book is really about is how active reading leads to synthesis and knowledge. And this guy's life is empty because he doesn't know how to process. He doesn't know how to synthesize. And so, I know that it's a hard read for people and not particularly user-friendly, but I'm hoping that people who try to read it are so beguiled by the magnificent illustrations that Lorenzo drew that they'll go along for the ride.
How much do you edit out from Ghosts?
Not a lot.
In terms of text?
Not
because I couldn't remember from the time I read it 25 years ago to reading this version. I'm like, it seems
it's pretty
full.
It's a lot of it's much richer because on most of the pages of Ghosts there are 150 words of text below the approximately 150 words of text below the each page. So, and in this case, I did once again a comprehensive sketch for the whole book, and gave it to Lorenzo, and he used all of my guidelines, especially when it came to shaking up the page and the panels or the layout. When the layout changed. But most of all of the drawings, he kind of like, it's
he's
okay.
Matoti. Yeah, I'm going to trust him on this.
How could you not?
Yeah.
And
he misspelled my name when he was signing a book once, and I was like, no, I'm not going to correct that at all. He's going. I'm just going to let him go.
Exactly. 2 L's is fine.
Yep. Do your thing, Lorenzo.
Yeah. And they came back, 10 times better than my. He just used my sketches as
sort of what needs to be here.
A diving board. Yeah.
But formally, it's a huge leap from Mazzucchelli's version to this, and then to having your own you do the illustration for the final one.
So all three of them had to look different.
Yeah.
And had to feel different because they're all three about different things. And they couldn't look too similar. You start comparing them artistically, which would get in the way of understanding what they're really about.
So tell me about the decision and how you approached the third book at that point.
Yeah.
And what was the timing for Matoti? And then
Matoti was well in the works and largely done by the time I actually started. The short story is that I was not my original choice for doing the final book.
Todd McFarlane? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, but he was busy, counting single dollar bills.
I was trying to come up with somebody on the fly that was going to be good for that.
And we went down a couple of unfortunate dead ends and missteps, let's say, and some of them fairly significant. and it's unfortunate, but at a certain point, Auster said, "Look, you know what you're doing. Just draw the book." And I hadn't even considered it. I would never have considered it because I don't have the confidence in my own drawing, and I'm getting stacked against titans.
Yeah.
Mazzucchelli and Matoti. So, and I said, "Are you sure? How about this?" And I showed him a couple of other artists, and he was like, "This is going on too long. Just this. Your breakdown is good. Your adaptation is good. Your ideas are good. Just go ahead and do this." And so I stepped up to the plate as best as I could. I don't have any illusions about my drawing. I did the best job that I could. I know the breakdown is solid, but I look at the drawing. I'm like, I try not to cringe.
I'm sorry. It's just one of those, you manage this achievement, this accomplishment, and it's something I call the automatic undercutting machine. It's from a postcard I got once of an old piece of mining equipment, and I realized, that characterizes my entire life. So, but I think you did a good job with it.
Thank you.
Having a color palette was a weird moment for me. I'm like, I think of this whole book in these stark black and white,
right.
Maybe because of prose.
Right, but adding the gray wash is well, once again, it really had to look unlike, as far different as possible as the other two books.
So did you keep the faith for 30 years that this is actually going to come together, or did it really...
Well, I just, I don't think faith had anything to do with it. I think it was really, all along, I've been a character in a Paul Auster novel, and I feel like I've just kind of bumbled through this thing, doing the best I can. But it was all, I'm someone who fundamentally doesn't really believe in fate per se. But this whole experience, I feel like I've been a pawn. And nothing could have happened faster. It couldn't, I had to meet Matoti, and he had to come to this 25-year anniversary, and he had to be in my head. And then, we had to have these false starts with these other artists before Auster insisted that I draw it. And in fact, one of the last bizarre things that happened was that we were going to be published by Auster's publisher, and it just seemed like, well, it's an Auster book, it gets published by Auster publisher, but his publisher doesn't publish graphic novels, and in fact, they gave me an editor who didn't know anything about comics and hadn't even read City of Glass, a young person. Yeah. And at first I thought, well, that's what's going on. And then I realized, well, maybe just as well I don't have somebody breathing down my neck, because I think I know what I'm doing here. And then Auster wanted to do a book about gun violence in America using the photographs taken by his son-in-law. It's a very, very powerful book, and I highly recommend it. It's not an easy read, but really wonderful. And the photographs are it's a wonderful book. But they couldn't publish that because they just don't publish picture books. And so Auster said, well, can I take it to my friend? I know the editor at Grove, the publisher editor at Grove. And so he moved it over, and he told me this. And I said, wait, maybe we could move the trilogy someplace. And my editor, Gail Hawkman, got involved. And the next thing I know, it sort of happened immediately that we got the books, including City of Glass. And so I called Chip Kidd. And, I knew Chip enough to be able to give him a call and said, this is what's happening. We've got these books, and, it's going to be the whole trilogy. And he was like, well, yeah, let's do it. Nice. And that's, that wouldn't have happened, 6 months earlier.
Yeah, step after step had to fall into place.
It all fell together. Yeah.
Again, not fate, but as close to it as. And when you get an Auster novel and you have the death of the author himself, and somehow the book keeps going after his passing, that's that gets even stranger. But
Auster said in an interview that I have, it's an audio clip that I have in my lecture, and it's really haunting. He says basically that, these characters, I believe they're alive when I'm writing them. I'm so involved in their lives that they actually come alive for me. And the idea that they're in a book after I finished writing it, and they're still alive in this book. And then he muses, he says, just thinking about how in the future I'll be dead and my characters will live on. It's a very powerful and interesting thing. And here it's happened.
And you said he got to see everything?
Yeah, he got to see all the guts and approve it. Unfortunately, he didn't get to see the cover, which I'm very pleased about. Not pleased that he didn't get to see it.
No, but it was one of those, when I got the announcement from the publisher's publicist, it was really? We finished the thing? Oh my God. And getting to see the cover, I guess at Mocha is where I first saw it in print. And it had just been unboxed when you saw it.
I
was floored and had we need to get together. I was thinking I would try to get David because I've recorded with you already around the Nancy book and recorded with Matoti. I'm like, they were like, David's not doing publicity for this thing. I'm like, okay, that's
anything, David.
Yeah. That was what I had when I met him years and years ago. I pitched him at CAB, and he's like, I don't really do interviews. I'm like, thank you for telling me that. I'm not going to sweat you about this ever again. If you ever want to at some point, I'm around, but I'm not going to be hey, going to see if you change your mind. So,
good strategy, Gil.
Yeah, and I'm fine with it. One of my happiest moments was recording with Pfeiffer and seeing a copy of Asterios Polyp on his sofa end table, and I just had you enjoying that? He's like, don't always get what's going on. Sure love the drawing, though. I'm like, okay, there you go.
Actually, I talked to Jules about it.
Yeah?
And he got it.
Good.
Yeah, he put it together. Maybe he had just finished it. But
he maybe it's still been in process when I met him. But,
he was very keen on the color.
Yeah.
On how David used the color.
A remarkable book. Yeah. That's I won't ask what he's working on because
he won't tell me, so I can't tell you.
not an issue, but I do have to ask. This is the second time we've gotten together, and both times have been for projects that originated kind of in the 80s into the 90s. Can you work more narrowly? Can you stop with a multi-decade projects? I'm just sort of wondering.
Well, I don't know if it's possible.
Yeah.
Things
need to gestate for
I just work at one speed, and Nancy took 10 years. This book took 10. I mean, this book took 30 years, right?
But the time of actual working was narrower.
A decade.
Yeah.
And the Fletcher Hanks collection, that was 10 years of my life from start to finish. Yeah. The book with my sister, which is a book that not many people have read, called The Ride Together, that came out actually after City of Glass. It's a memoir of growing up with our oldest brother who had autism. Chapters in comics written, drawn by me, alternating chapters of prose written by my sister Judy, who's a magnificent and very funny writer. And that probably took 10 years too, start to finish. So I think I just work at one speed. I don't, and I'm ready for things to change because there's not too many years left, and I'm just like hitting my stride.
No, this is always the thing that I'll say concerns me. I just, with older artists, especially anyone older than me, because that makes them old. Anyone younger than me is some goddamn whippersnapper. But I think Seth was the first guy I really came across this with, where Seth being Seth, had sort of plotted out the next 15 years, figuring that was about as much time as he had to draw. And then I look at like Bill Griffith, who I've recorded with a few times over 10 years, and he just... put the strip to the side for a little while and started working on my next graphic novel.
Exactly.
And he just goes and goes and goes.
And he just keeps getting better. Griffey's work
I've told that story before. I don't understand how his art gets tighter with every year, because I keep thinking as you get old, you're going to start loosening up. He's like, no, it's the opposite, Gil. I'm like, you're a genius, and I'm just
And not just the drawing, like the whole narrative engine is just fabulous.
Every morning I get a little Zen bomb that goes off in my head when I'm sitting down, turn on the email, and this thing just blows up my brain.
But this graphic, who knew that he had these graphic novels, and not just one or two?
Yeah.
You know,
I got to see the new one when he was working on it. I think it's coming out this year. The one about his great uncle.
Yep.
Or great whatever.
Yeah.
The photographer.
The photographer.
But it's just seeing him work more freely on a full size page instead of just it's holding one artist to another one's productivity or scale. I've learned early on doing all this stuff. It's just everybody's got their own pace, construction, etc. I'm just hoping your stuff will not take decades, because I don't want to spend another 10 years before we get to sit down together again.
Thank you. I hope not.
It was over 7 years. I had to go look up when you and I and Mark Newgarden had sat down. That was 2018. So
7 years.
Yeah, that's not good. We should, even if there's not a project, we should get to sit down and gab more often. But when it comes to adapting this book, these 3 books, the New Yorks that they are set in and signify. Rereading City of Glass, at first it was that moment of, I was reading this in the early 90s, and it is a late 70s into early 80s New York. And then with Ghosts, things go farther back and then things change for The Locked Room. Keeping those other New Yorks in your head, understanding, how the city has changed, I guess, when it comes to not just the visual adaptation, but just sort of understanding the spirits of the city. Did that factor into how you were adapting these things as years are progressing and those things are receding farther and farther?
No, because
I'm overthinking it. I know.
No, not overthinking it at all. But it's an important aspect of the 3 books that all 3 of them. Often when one thinks of a trilogy, one thinks, okay, we're going following the same characters through the decades, and they're not. They don't have the same characters. They don't have the same concerns, and they don't take place in the same eras. But there's appearance by. There's baseball and movies, and the Brooklyn Bridge might be mentioned in all 3 of them. There's certain landmark New York aspects. Certainly, the City of Glass of the 3, New York is a
most
character.
Grounded. Yeah, it is the most situated.
And actually is a character in the book. It's a player. Once again, thank goodness we had David Mazzucchelli to be able to draw it. And then Ghosts, you go back in several decades earlier, and I think Lorenzo does a great job of capturing the styles and some of the architecture of New York, but it's less prominent. And then finally, with The Locked Room, New York is not such a big factor. It has to look like Brooklyn Heights, when the apartment buildings need to.
But it really has to be about the people.
Yeah, exactly. Or rather, Chelsea. It has to look like Chelsea. But that's about it. Yeah, it's more about the people.
How's your New York changed?
Well,
I know you moved to Martha's Vineyard decades ago. But
exactly.
You come back.
I get down to the city less and less often. It's when I go, I have a great time. The last time I went, I spent a day at the Cloisters, and then I spent another day at the Metropolitan. I'm interested in if I go to a museum or a gallery, I'm interested in our early Renaissance or pre-Renaissance art. That's sort of the thing that I'm most interested in looking at these days. And then particularly the narrative shifts between different artists depicting the same event. That's something I find intriguing. So those are, the things that I loved when I lived in the city. On the way to the Met, I'll stop at the candy store on Lexington Avenue and have egg cream. Now it costs $5. It used to cost $1.50. So certain aspects, but most of New York, it's just seems more like a theme park than it did. I was living there in the 70s, and it was quite a different city, much edgier and uncomfortable, and crime was much higher. But, and it was threatening back then, and now I'm, of course, quite nostalgic because that was when I was in my 20s, and
It's as Fran Lebowitz has said, the golden age for any city is when you were there in your 20s.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's always having New York at a distance, 25 miles away from the city. My whole life, there's always that sense of going in, sampling, and getting the hell out. But yes, being left in a pinball arcade at I think 9 years old, while my mom was trying to get the 2-for-1 Broadway tickets at that kiosk, while my brother and I were
playing pinball
and seeing people nodding out in that old 1980 Times Square, as opposed to what it became. There's a whole child endangerment aspect to it now that we didn't really pick up on when we were young.
That's right.
Very, very different city in a lot of respects. But where'd comics start for you?
What?
Where'd comics start for you?
Where did they start for me?
Yeah. I don't think we talked about it with the Nancy book. We were very focused on that, and I don't know your history.
Yeah, so my parents were very well read. My mother's favorite author was probably Nabokov, and my father was extraordinary, very erudite, but spent his time reading mostly mysteries. He would read 2 or 3 mysteries a week. And so, the walls were lined with books, but they were also very comics friendly. My dad liked Pogo, and so had all the Pogo paperbacks. They had the brick red Crazy Cat book with the introduction by E. Cummings. So I was exposed to, and then the New Yorker album of albums on that super thick glossy paper of cartoons. My house was filled with those things, and so we got the Washington Post in the morning, and my dad would bring the Evening Star home from work at night. So every day there were 2 strong doses, and this was like the 1960s. So this is the end of the great era of the comic strip, and Peanuts had just come out, but there was also Dick Tracy and Little Orphan Annie. It was really great comic strip. So I was very into that stuff growing up. And then I discovered superhero comics when I was about 11 years old, and began reading them and collecting them. But once again, I had stacks of superhero comics. And my mom, this is before people put them in plastic bags, I think. And my mom found a plastic bag manufacturer 45 minutes away and said, if you like these things, you should take care of them. And she would we had paper napkins that came in boxes, and she would take the boxes. They are exactly the width of a comic book. And she took me out to this plastic bag manufacturer, and they had plastic bags that were exactly the right size. And so I still have thousands of comic books from my youth, late 60s and early 70s, Marvel and DC Comics, So, and at the same time, I go to the public library and read all the history of comics. And then I started collecting all of those books, and I've got, the full library of the history of comics. And, it's just what I was into.
At what point did it become this could be my life?
Oh, I kind of never thought it could be my life because I didn't have confidence, and I still don't have,
as you mentioned, not having confidence in your drawing.
In my drawing.
Yeah.
And then I went to Pratt, and I was studying graphic design, and I got out of Pratt with a graphic design degree and realized, God, after 6 months of freelancing, this is the last thing I want to do. Make other people's crap look good.
Make the logo bigger.
Yeah, really was depressing. But I began teaching simultaneously, which is really the thing I do best. Yeah. That's my greatest skill is as a teacher. I know that. So I was teaching, and then there was at the School of Visual Arts, I heard that there was comics classes, and so I just started taking classes with Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman and Art Spiegelman. And, Will Eisner, not a great teacher, but I was in awe of his work. I was a huge Spirit fan at the time. Harvey Kurtzman, not a great teacher, wonderful guy, and I knew I was in the presence of God, so every minute was vital. But meeting Art Spiegelman changed my life. After I don't know, maybe the third class, we went out for coffee, and then after the fourth class, he invited me down to their loft. I met Francoise, and basically was offered the job to be associate editor of Raw. Like, that's like within 6 weeks of meeting Art Spiegelman. And that's when I realized, working with those two people, I really began to understand what it would be to be a cartoonist. Like the degree of commitment, the amount of work. And it's not only about the drawing, it's really about the thinking. And I understood the formal aspects of comics as really appealed to me.
Did you have an understanding, I'll just say, of art comics prior to that? Or were you still coming from a superhero world?
No.
And then
by that time, I'd left the superhero.
Okay.
I'd left childish things behind. And
people don't.
For me, it was college. My mother got me my first. My mother, I was probably 12 or 13 years old, and she got me a Robert Crumb comic.
Nell was saying something similar. He was way too young when he first started.
Way too young. And she did, it was a big oversized Ballantine collection called Head Comics, which was just a bunch of stuff that he'd done for various undergrounds thrown together in a large format. And, like probably what Dan said, I had permanent brain damage as a result. And my mother, she was, I was like, Mom, do you know what you just got, a couple of weeks later. And she said, well, I didn't really, I just knew that this drawing was so great that you had to see it. That's my mother. Something. That is my mother. I had
the two stories of one I told last week with David Denby, how my parents took me to History of the World Part 1 when I was 9, because it was a Mel Brooks movie, and to them that's just funny, where to me and my brother, who's 3 years older, it was
sex jokes and
this is great. You've melted my brain, and that's cool. The other weird one was my in-laws going over my Amazon wish list one year to figure out something to get me for Christmas when we came to visit, and ordering Black Hole by Charles Burns. So you get why opening that up. I'm like, I'm guessing you did not open this before wrapping it up. So let's just hide this away. They're not going to know what they just gave me as a But so your mom melted your brain with Crumb way too early, and that kind of set you.
I don't know. I think it was exactly the right time.
Oh yeah,
because the brain is always, especially as a teenager, and as a kid, you want to know like the next thing.
Yeah.
You want to.
Because I didn't get it when I was young. I didn't get Kirby when I was a kid.
Yeah,
because
I didn't either.
Kirby of that era was not good in the 70s and 80s, and Crumb was too. I didn't understand Wolverton or any of that world, so Crumb didn't make sense to me until college, where I started to have the this guy's a genius, and I'm just
late to catch it,
not getting it. But we all find these things at the right times, I guess.
Absolutely.
And that ties into my Mazzucchelli moment with Daredevil and Batman were nice when I was 15, 16 years old, but you made the jump, and I was there to make the jump with you. So
nice.
But so you had an indie art vibe going into the Raw world. It wasn't.
And I knew Art's work. I had a copy of Breakdowns, which Breakdowns is just a real seminal text for cartoonists of my ilk and my vintage. And so I had a full collection of all the underground comics as well. So I knew it well.
And what did you learn through Raw? Through working in that world? Because I have a whole Gary Panter story I'll tell you off mic because it's a little too goofy. But
what did I learn from Art and Francoise? How much fucking work it is to make the comics without compromise. And anything else is not worth doing. So, I mean, that's the reason, we were sort of making light of everything taking me 10 years to do.
But it matters.
Yeah, it matters to me. Otherwise, why do it?
Before we started recording, when I'm telling you all the crazy, fucked up things I do for my day job, and then say, by the way, this keeps coming out every week.
Yeah, right. It's compulsive. Yeah. So that's what I learned from them. They're really hardworking. They're very hard focused, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate the fact that they let me into that because, as I say, it was really life-changing for me.
When did you realize you could teach? Not just that you were a teacher, but when did you realize it was...
Well, that was the thing I knew I could do from childhood. Okay. Yeah, I went to a progressive private school, an elementary school, followed by years of public school. But I went to an extraordinarily great school called the Greenacre School in Rockville, Maryland. And I had, by the time I was in 6th grade, I had 4 or 5 master teachers. I mean, master teachers. Teachers who could teach the same material 6 different ways in a half-an-hour class. And very open-minded. It was, the mid to late 60s. So some of my teachers were just out of Antioch, and some of them were seasoned elderly people, pros. And my first grade teacher, she was actually my kindergarten and first grade teacher, a woman named Nell Campbell. By the time I was in 6th grade, I was helping her in the first grade class teach. It was just something I knew I could do. And I, as I said, I'm an okay cartoonist. I know I'm good, but I'm a really good teacher. It's the thing that I do. It's my best skill because I actually care about my students and I care about my classroom, and I want my students to succeed, and I've got something to impart. In fact, I'm starting this fall, this end of August, my own online graphic novel workshops.
I saw something on Instagram, so I wasn't sure if this is... Yeah. Talk about it. What's the...
Yeah, so the idea is I've been teaching graphic novel workshops at the Center for Cartoon Studies for the past, 10, 12 years, maybe longer. And I'll continue to teach those in person at the end of July. I'm teaching one coming up. But now I'm going to start doing my own online workshop so that anyone from around the world can do a Monday through Friday workshop. Come to my workshop with a story for a long form piece, and it can be kind of a vague idea, and by the end of the week you will know what your idea is. You'll have hammered it out into some sort of story structure and ideally a set of thumbnails to get you going on the thumbnail to sketch process. You'll know the steps of the classic workflow and begin to tinker it into making it your own. There's also an aspect of the class that, having taught it so many times, that I know is very therapeutic, because you're getting to know yourself as, perhaps for the first time, as a steadily focused creator. And that can bring up some interesting personal issues, too, which become part of what we work through during the workshop. Not necessarily.
But when it happens, you're there to help facilitate it.
Yeah. And so it's the other important thing is that it's what I really like is having a variety of different people: younger people, older people, people from diverse backgrounds, and people with diverse skill levels. Beginning cartoonists. Steve Bissett has taken my class twice.
Really?
Yeah.
Steve being a very seasoned veteran.
Yeah, very seasoned veteran. But he's a wonderful class participant, also a seasoned teacher, too. So,
I knew he was part of CCS.
He was, yeah.
And I was reading his stuff. High school years,
Swamp Thing,
the Swamp Thing stuff, and then when he was doing Taboo, when he was editing that anthology, and then did the dinosaur strip, where once again the multi-decade thing starts to creep into people's work. So I hope you got him focused and really got him narrowly.
Oh yeah, I got him nailed down.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it was. I mentioned doing a 2-page script for Dean Haspiel earlier, and stealing some of Mazzucchelli from that. Yeah. I was late, and I figured, Dean's got enough submissions anyway. He kept needling me with, "Hey, Gil, I really want to see this story from you." I overthought and over-engineered this entire thing, and luckily had reread City of Glass just as I was figuring out an angle, and it's a very New York-focused strip. And I had the breakthrough that gave me a finish for it, B, a unifying theme for these just 2 pages, but still figured, okay, whatever. I've ridiculously overthought this whole thing. I'm just going to send it to him. He can politely say, sorry, Gil, it was too late. He comes back with, this is fantastic. You can't take a single panel out. This is perfect. Get some thumbnails together and let's get rolling. I'm like, God damn it. Now I feel validated as an artist. This is even worse.
That's great.
Because now I do have to actually
do it.
Draw. Yeah. Keeping in mind, I'm visualizing it when he wanted thumbnails and layouts. I'm like, I don't think you understand. The whole thing is already laid out in my head. That it just took me forever to put it on a page in a way that was translatable. But it's those moments of realization that you can actually create something, and that an outside person might actually
appreciate it,
see something in it. Yeah, that's well, it's just disturbing. Frankly, that's I'm just not used to it at this point. We're here, by the way, at Yaddo at an artist retreat. Tell me about this place for you and what you're hoping to achieve while you're here. Is this the first time?
This is my second time at Yaddo.
Tell me about the experience. Tell me what it does for you.
It's just so if your listeners aren't familiar with this place, it's a huge estate just outside of Saratoga Springs, New York, which is known for its racetrack and for its therapeutic waters. And it's a very bourgeois town. And this just magnificent. Right now we're sitting in what is known as the music room.
Yeah, I should take some pictures so that the listeners will be able to see it when I post them.
With a sort of Citizen Kane fireplace that you could walk into. And Steinway Grand over there. And the Corporation of Yaddo makes this place available for artists to come and have a retreat. And I just kind of stumbled into it. Yeah. I didn't know what it was. And a friend of mine suggested that I apply to it because I just needed some time to work. I applied to this thing, and so I applied to it, and then I got in, and then it's so kind of embarrassing to admit, but then I realized, this is a place where,
serious
pretty much
names.
Any famous 20th century author, musician, painter has spent time here. And I feel very fortunate to have been accepted not once, but twice. And for me, it is not relaxing experience. It's just I'm working. Yeah. I'm up by 7 every morning and in the studio by 8, and I work all day. Take a break for some exercise.
You mentioned a yoga session before I got here.
Yes,
so
I took a yoga class on the lawn.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's beautiful weather.
And worked up a great sweat and just came back from that, which was wonderful. And I've got a beautiful bedroom it's called the Oratory. Is the name of the room, and a bathroom across the hall with a Tiffany stained glass window. And then my studio, there's some modern, contemporary, large studios that painters have. There's a sculptor in a studio right now. But my studio is just a little one-room cabin way out in the woods. I ride my bike to it, and it's very rustic, and it's perfect. So after dinner, I go back out there for a couple more hours and see what happens. I have a couple of deadlines. Then I'm finishing a piece for the Boston Globe and a full page for the New York Times. So I'm puttering around with those things, and then I've started a couple of new projects. I'm doing a little painting, but all I'm doing is focusing on my work and trying to figure out sort of what the next big project is going to be. For me, unlike, let's say, Bill Griffith that we mentioned, Bill has able to come up with these I can't speak for him because I don't know how it happens for him. But for me, when I try to make a project occur, it generally doesn't work. Yeah. City of Glass, the whole story of City of Glass, I had no choice. Mm-hmm. The Fletcher Hanks book, I had no choice. The Nancy book with Mark Newgarden, we basically had no choice. It just, the way it happened, it had to happen.
Yeah. I foisted that book off on people, especially people who want to teach comics. I had NYU people saying, so what would we use if we were going to, I was like, I know this is going to sound weird.
Yeah.
How to Read Nancy will open up so many aspects of what goes on.
Absolutely.
In just a couple of panels.
That's in my classes that I teach, we start the semester off with that comic strip, that Nancy comic strip from August 8th, 1959, because pretty much 80% of everything you need to know about how comics are put together is hidden in that single strip, and that's what the whole book is about.
But you were saying forcing an idea versus...
Yeah, forcing, letting the idea come from me and grabbing me by my lapels and dragging me into a decade.
Do you have a moment of recognition with those?
Oh, it's an innate feeling. Yeah. Yeah, even for the shorter projects. Mm-hmm. Like this strip that I'm doing for the New York Times, it came to me already built, and as soon as I did the sketch, I knew I had to send it out to someone. And once again, I didn't know where it would go. Like, it didn't have a home. And then right the next day, I saw somebody had a sketchpad page in the New York Times. I'm like, what the sketchpad? What's that? Yeah. Who's the editor? I sent it to the editor, and they're like, yeah, we'll take this. Perfect. Yeah. It was like, it just kind of meant to happen. It's about searching online for to try to go, when I went to New York last time, to get a ticket to the new Frick Museum. And as I'm going online searching to get a ticket, which was impossible, I remembered that there's an Amy Mann song about the Frick Museum based on a project that she was going to do, which was a musical adaptation of Girl Interrupted. And there's a scene at the beginning of Girl Interrupted, evidently, that takes place in the Frick Museum. And Amy Mann took the lyrics of this, and I did adaptation of that song. And in the course of doing it, without spoiling the ending, I found out where the title for the book Girl Interrupted came from. So it's all
have to go look
built
it
in
up.
there.
So no spoilers. I'm going to go find this myself. But I'm hoping to get to the Frick at some point once
it calms down a little bit. Yeah, my daughter just kind of walked in. She was from New Orleans 2 weeks ago, and she just went on a whim, and they said, go on it. So give it a try. Yeah, it used to be a favorite museum of mine. The funny thing was, when they moved temporarily into the former Whitney site, the artwork that to me benefited the most was the Fragonards, those French ones, which I hated in the Whitney itself, because they had that. Oh, just all that fussiness in the room, and when they were hanging by themselves with this stark, dark. It's like, I can actually look at these paintings now and take in some of the pretty entertaining subtext that's going on there that I was just not catching because of my innate revulsion to the entire room they were in before. Well, plus it's sort of adding. It's like putting another layer of icing on the cake. Fragonards already
they're very
dense
confectionery
and frilly, and all those little twirls in there. So
having them just hanging in sort of an empty space in the brewer was it transformed my way of seeing them. Whereas the Rembrandts and such I was already on board with. But it's sometimes we need to recontextualize the things. Yeah, and what a difference it makes. Yeah. But you're feeling productive in this, outside of being shanghaied for an hour or two by some schlub from New Jersey. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yesterday was particularly, I start every Saturday morning drawing up my batch for the New Yorker, cartoons for the New Yorker, and that sometimes I sit down and I'll know within 10 or 15 minutes whether that's going to happen or not. Yeah. And yesterday morning I just sat down and boom, 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 it just all. And in that batch of 10 or 12 cartoons, there's one or two that are actually good. So that's good track record. That felt good. And that was before lunch. In the afternoon, I did this painting, and then I'm working on a 28-page comic story that
I have no idea what's going to happen to it. Mm-hmm. But it's like all came into focus in the last 24 hours. So yeah, I'm feeling much better today. This is than I did like the middle of last week.
Gotcha. Again, we talked about what my last week was like, so I'm glad yours is better.
Exactly. So this place, Yaddo, gives artists. I'm the only cartoonist here, but they've had Ken Kremstein was here.
Dean has been here.
Dean was here. A couple of other cartoonists, young cartoonists named Lyd Conklin was here the last time I was here. They have a new graphic novel out that I haven't seen. But mostly they're writers or painters. There's a film editor here is a really interesting guy.
How much do you interact with the other residents?
This is a good Yaddo story because the first time I came, you get a tour of the place and somebody sits you down and says, okay, there's only 2 rules here. One rule is that during the day, you don't disturb anyone. Like you don't just drop by somebody's studio. You have to be invited. Okay? And if you see somebody, just leave them alone. Everyone is on their own. At 6:30, you have to show up for dinner. And I'm like, that's it? That's it. I said, yeah. And I said, well, that's interesting rules. Why do you have to show up at 6? Well, we want to know that you're okay. In fact, the story is that in the early 2000s, they didn't have this rule. There was just one rule, that you couldn't butt into anyone's business. And they added this because an artist, I believe it was a painter, Anne, I can't remember her name, a painter, didn't come to dinner, and nobody noticed that she didn't show up. And nobody noticed that she wasn't at breakfast, and it wasn't until the next day that they found the poor woman had died in her studio.
Yeah.
The good part of that story, however, is that it was as told to me, it was known that if her working process was such that if she had a good day in the studio, she would reward herself with a belt of scotch and some really good chocolate.
And that was scattered on the floor around?
Not scattered on the floor. When the coroner did the autopsy, they found chocolate and scotch in her.
She went out on a high note.
She went out on a high note, yeah.
Do you have to, not have to, is there a showing of one's work or
very
readings?
Casual. If you,
because I think one of my friends, Samuel Delaney, I think was here once or twice and did readings from some of his more graphically explicit work that I was like, okay, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a real safe place to share this work. And it's right now the group is very cohesive and it's nice to have supper with these people. I like them. We're talking about literature. Last night we got a long discussion about Percival Everett's James and why some people and the Pulitzer and why some people like certain things and other people like other things. And, it's an amazingly wonderful novel. So it's, it's a lively discussion by people who are into that sort of thing. And then if you want to, you get up at the end of the meal and tink your glass and look on meat over here, and I'm going to show slides. In fact, we had this week, the film editor showed of several nights a very long project that he's working on that he can't show anyplace else for various reasons. And, so we felt it's really been a privilege to see this magnificent piece of work that most likely will never be shown. So, like Samuel Delaney, he's not going to show the sexually explicit.
Oh, he tends to enjoy doing that to people, so having an environment here to work through that.
And the people are going to be into it. This is really cool. So probably I'll share something that I worked on at the end in the 2 weeks.
The big question, which I should have warned you was coming, what are you reading? Or what have you been reading?
Well, right this very minute, I went to the Yaddo library where they have works that have been contributed by previous authors. And I found, I looked under Auster, and there was I've read all the books, but there was a slim volume of poetry an edition of 100 or 200 or something copies that Auster put out in 1977 before he had written any fiction.
Yeah.
He translated some French
I remember
text.
He did translation. I didn't know if that was...
And so I got that out and I started reading it, and I'm not sure what to make of it yet. I just read a few last night. And I also got out a copy of Jules Pfeiffer's Passionella.
Yeah.
And that's... I'm thinking of... I'm working shorter pieces, and, it's fabulous. Monroe is just, one of the... a very key text for me earlier on, Jules Pfeiffer's Monroe. And I'm also listening, I think for the third time, to George Saunders' A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, which also to me is sort of a seminal text.
In terms of teaching or your literary
Just in
reading?
terms of what I'm interested in.
Okay.
And I was not, the first time I read it, I was not that familiar with the Russian authors that he concludes in that. And I've subsequently become a fan of, particularly Chekhov. And I don't know if you know the premise of this book. Do you know this book?
I knew it was related to teaching the works, but through analyzing a couple of stories.
Exactly.
And I had a Chekhov discovery in my 40s, and it was the same.
It's great.
Oh shit, I've been missing this for all these decades.
Right, the guy's fucking great.
Yeah.
And so what Saunders does is, it's sort of a textbook of his graduate fiction class at Syracuse. You read a story, and then he is your guide through it. And you do different kinds of exercises, but I don't mean to make it sound too pedantic, because George is such a charismatic and relaxed and funny and generous guide. And so you get to hear this, some famous actor reading a Chekhov or Tolstoy or Turgenev story, and then on comes George and he says, "Well, what do you guys think of that?" And let's say, what happened in that first paragraph? What did you learn by the first page? What was your questions? And how does this clock work? Let's take it apart and put it out on the table.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, whether any of that you feel feeding back into yourself as a teacher versus
Absolutely.
As a reader in general.
Absolutely. It's just what I'm interested in. Yeah. And it's really one of my core concerns is how the clock got built. I do occasional pieces for my local newspaper, the Vineyard Gazette, graphic reports, and they're always about how things are put together and interesting people who are doing interesting things, how the town clock is wound once a week, and how the mechanism for that works, and what that job is like to climb in the clock tower. I just find that stuff really interesting.
Again, we go back to the formal nature of comics and storytelling, of understanding Auster and what he was getting at throughout these things. I'm very glad that he validated your thesis about the trilogy also.
You and me both.
As opposed to what are you talking
exactly,
about?
Well, we wouldn't have this book today.
I happen to have Mr. McLuhan right here.
Exactly. Exactly.
But I'm very glad this all came together. And I'm glad, not just that we recorded, and we were going to do a remote a couple of weeks ago, and I'm awfully glad we're getting to do it here instead, because this whole environment is just an absolute joy.
Yeah, it feels like the right place to be doing this, because, I might come across sounding like I'm completely self-involved, but usually this would have been harder for me to do if I was home, but here I'm focused on my work and my work process, and be given the great gift and luxury and privilege, extraordinary privilege, to be able to just indulge my own self, whereas at home I'm so scattered.
Our time is sliced into
little pieces, and
there's a reason I do these on weekends. Like people try and pitch, "Hey, can you do one during the week?" I'm like, you don't want that Gil having a conversation with you. You want weekend Gil having the conversation, because it just we segment ourselves too much.
Well, thank you so much for making this possible and taking the time to be able to do this, 'cause it's been very interesting for me. I'm just busy in my own head putting these little jigsaw puzzle pieces together. And it does feel very self-indulgent, but at the same time, it's kind of necessary for me to move on with my work, which is something that really has to happen.
And I'm glad we got to kind of step back and see the puzzle put together.
Yeah.
So, well, thanks for coming on, and I'm glad we got to,
Be in the music room.
This is incredible. I'm going to pitch them on doing a podcast studio so I can come up every couple of weeks and do shows.
The music of chance.
Yeah. And that was Paul Karasik. Go get Paul Auster's The New York Trilogy by Paul Karasik, David Mazzucchelli, and Lorenzo Mattotti. It's out now from Pantheon. It really is an amazing feat of adaptation. The cartooning is just phenomenal. The thought that goes into each page and what's there and what's not there it's just amazing to read. There's some really phenomenal cartooning. And we'll say Mattotti is engaged in illustration into cartooning throughout this, but go get this book. You'll just revel in a lot of these pages. Now, I know we didn't talk too deeply about the stories of the novels themselves, but they really do need to unfold for you as a reader, especially with each of these different modes of story that are there. So while you're at it, if you're interested in how comics work, if you're more of an Auster reader or you're just coming to this from a non-comics perspective, go get Paul's collaboration with Mark Newgarden, How to Read Nancy. It is a truly amazing exploration into almost everything comics can do in just a few seemingly simple panels. Now you can follow Paul at his site, paulkarasik.com. That's PaulKarasik.com. His graphic novel workshop is on that site /graphic-novel-lab. You should also check out his Patreon, which is Paul Karasik, all one word, and his Instagram, Karasik Comics, where comics has a K for the C's that are there. I'll have links to all this stuff in the show and episode notes for this one, so don't worry. Oh, and I did post a couple of pics of the big room in Yaddo on the episode page for this one, too. Thanks for listening to the Virtual Memories Show. You can support this podcast by telling other people about it. There's no better way to build an audience than through word of mouth. Also, visit Apple's podcast page for us and leave a rating and review. Every little bit helps, you know? You can also support the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it and who you'd like to hear me record with or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or comic or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard, letter, email, DM if we're connected on Instagram or Blue Sky, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. Messages can be up to 3 minutes long. It'll cut you off after that, so call back and leave another message if you do. And let me know if it'd be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with our listeners, but I'd never run someone's message without their permission, so let me know. Now, if you've got money to spare, I appreciate it, but don't give it to me. I've got a day job that pays the bills. You should give to individuals and institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, all those crowdfunding platforms, where you'll find people who really need help just trying to make ends meet or get an artistic project going, covering medical bills or car payments or veterinary bills, and just a few dollars from you might make a real difference in their lives. Now, when it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank and World Central Kitchen every month, but there are a lot of other things you can give to the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, Election Funds, Planned Parenthood, and Women's Choice. There's a lot of things you can do with your money to try to help build a better world, so I hope you'll give. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You can visit my archives at vmspod.com to check out my 2018 conversation with Hal, where you can learn more about his art, his music, and more. And you can follow Hal on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/May4th. That's MAY, the number 4TH. And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download all our past episodes at Apple Podcasts and other podcast sources. And you can find all my episodes and sign up for the Virtual Memories Show newsletter at vmspod.com. And I'm also on Blue Sky and Instagram and YouTube as vmspod. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.